What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Punching Up. I am your host, Maya May, and today I'm going to share with you a little bit of my trauma. I have poems upon my experience at Catholic school. Yes, I went to Catholic school for 3 years, and so and this was kindergarten, first and second grade. And so my first experience with the church was being beaten by the nuns at St. Casimir's. And so until till this day, I won't wear Kelly green. Every time I see Kelly green, it reminds me of St. Casimir's, which is no longer in existence. Not because our nuns used to beat us. I think they just eventually closed up shop because maybe there weren't as many people who are interested in sending their children to Catholic school. Not sure, but because of that experience and experience at my grandmother's Baptist church and experience at the end of a switch, that's when your grandmother makes you go out into the backyard and get a stick that she can beat you with because God. Because of that, I've been long fascinated by religion, as many of you know, and so I love to have on people who are part of the evangelical faith or used to be, or who are deconstructing, as tonight's guest is, and so I'm incredibly excited about tonight's guest. You've probably seen his videos on Instagram. He's a public theologian, speaker, and writer on Christian spirituality. He was a pastor for 8 years. He went to Bob Jones University. Like, he was deep in the thick of it. And now he has a book coming out called Hellbent. And as you know, right now, the GOP seems to be hell-bent on making us all live in hell now. That's the question a lot of us are asking is, are we already in hell? Because it sure feels like it. So, with all that being said, let's figure out how do we get out of this hell with our guest tonight, Brian Recker. What's up? Welcome to Punching Up.
Hey, good to be here, Maya. Thanks for having me. I love
No,
that
I'm
intro.
I'm glad you're here because you've survived what sounds like a pretty intense, I won't call it traumatic, I won't label it as trauma, but my experience with the church was trauma. When you hear stories about people's first experience with religion, does it make you go like how are you feeling? Is it like that?
Totally unsurprised. I mean, that's Christianity classic right there. Unfortunately, and that's really what my book is about, the fact that so much of Christian spirituality, and I don't believe all Christians, I still consider myself a Christian, so I'm not this kind of Christian anymore, but so much of Christianity is really centered on a punitive worldview. And that was what you were experiencing, was punishment that was really justifiable because their God is a punishing God. And so it really allows for punishment in the way we treat each other, the way we structure society, soup to nuts.
So and yeah, because I was at the end of a ping pong paddle way too many times, and that is the premise of your book. Can you talk a little bit about what drove you to write this book, and then the entire title, because it's hell bent, and then the rest of it.
How the fear of hell holds Christians back from a spirituality of love. And that's my hope. My hope is that people will find a spirituality that is rooted in punishment, that is more liberating and leads to freedom and wholeness. Um, I, I mean, this book started in some ways very much how you had formative experiences. For me, I learned about hell really when I learned about God. Those concepts were really inseparable. In fact, Christians and especially evangelicals, you may be familiar with the language that's quite pervasive of a relationship with God. Like a lot of Christians like to say, this isn't religion, it's a relationship. And yet, for me, that relationship began when I was about 5 years old, when I learned about heaven and hell. And really what it meant to become into a relationship with God was I was told I was a wicked sinner, I deserved hell, that I was going to die and go to hell for my sins, and that would be just, that would be deserved unless I got saved or was born again or converted or accepted Jesus into my heart, whatever language you want to use. That was based on the fact that if I didn't do those things, I was going to go to hell. So to come into a relationship with God was inextricably linked to the coercive premise that if you weren't in that relationship, God was going to punish you. And so we can see, I mean, if you apply that rubric to any other relationship, it's kind of a toxic relationship.
Well, that's the thing. You talk about toxic theology, and your book is rich with new vocabulary, I think, for a lot of people. So, and I just want to remind everyone the reason we're talking about this is because we have people like Pete Hegseth, who is a Secretary of War now, and that very much believe in this sort of dominating abusive, toxic sort of theology. Yes, there it is. The Department of War, as Jesus
Oh
would have
man.
wanted, right?
And I mean, he's gleeful about it, and he's a very public Christian. He's very public about his Christian faith. But when you ask what's his Christianity about, what's the center of, what's it doing for him, I don't think it's leading him into what I would consider true spirituality, which is love, connection, really seeing yourself in the vulnerable and the vulnerable in yourself, because we're all made of the same stuff and we're all in this together. That's the kind of spirituality I want. But when your spirituality is rooted in punishment and exclusion, it really justifies an exclusionary worldview. I mean, for hell, for some people, is the ultimate act of exclusion. I've had people say, when I question hell, that heaven does not have open immigration. In fact, God does not allow any illegal immigration from hell to heaven. God has a border wall around heaven. And so when you have this mindset of this ultimate exclusion being at the very heart of existence and spirituality, you can see why many Christians might celebrate something like Alligator Alcatraz.
Which, right, the hypocrisy of it all is, I think, what people are having a hard time really reconciling with. In your view, what happens if the average American, one who is not steeped in this theology, what happens if we don't have a better understanding of the Pete Hegseths of the world? I almost feel like we'll be stuck in this, like, but they're hypocrites, but they're hypocrites.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of people are confused. Like, how is this Christian? Where are they getting this? For me, it really is not surprising at all. I think you have to ask, whenever you have a majority culture religion, Christianity is not when it started, it was an underclass of people. They were persecuted by the Roman Empire. These were people that were on the underside, really under the boot of empire. And it was a resistance movement, giving voice to the least of these. The church, the early church, was a voice for the poor. Unfortunately, when Christianity aligned with power structures, this often happens that instead of becoming a voice for the poor, it becomes a tool of the oppressors to keep people in line, and to, rather than to break down those hierarchies of domination, can become a tool to reinforce those hierarchies of domination. And so, unfortunately, that's what much of American Christianity has become. And I'm not going to say all, certainly, but it can be used that way. And that's why it's very important, I think, for those of us who still find ourselves with at least one foot in that faith. And I'm stubbornly still calling myself a Christian, even though many conservative Christians would love to rule me out and say that I'm not a real Christian. Thankfully, there's no governing body for that. They can't actually tell me that I'm not a Christian. But I want to fight for what actually the message of Jesus was, which Jesus was just always standing with the vulnerable.
Well, yeah, and I actually saw somebody post in comments that if Jesus were to come back, they're pretty sure he would be like Zoran Mamdani, and everybody in the comments was like, "Yeah, that actually tracks." And this idea of wanting to live together in harmony is obviously not advantageous to the prison industrial complex or to all of the weapons manufacturers. So, for many reasons, I can understand why
Right.
this idea of us living in love and harmony is not popular. But you are trying to create new spaces, community-based spaces. You talk about being happy when you go to church. You go to church smiling. Can you talk about how one finds that joy in church?
Well, I think what robs our joy often is obligation, guilt, and shame. And for many of us, shame and guilt are the very stuff of spirituality. And often we've been in spaces where, yes, we had to go to church because what if? What if we go to hell? What if we're going to be punished in some way? And there it was often threats being used to keep people in line. And I don't think threats are a good foundation to cultivate love. A healthy spirituality doesn't come from that place. You can keep people in line. You can get control. Fear can produce control, but it doesn't produce connection. Only love can do that. So yeah, when I point out in my book that I go to church smiling because I don't have to go, and sometimes I don't go. I go because I want to go. I go because I love to feel connected to myself, to other people. I love to sing again. You know, some people, their only thought of Christian music is manipulation, because it's like they're trying to produce a particular reaction in you, like give your heart to the Lord, come forward and get saved, respond to the altar call. I sing because it's human. It binds us together. It reminds us that we're all a part of one big connected thing. We're not siloed individual people. And that is a deeply spiritual act. But guilt, shame, and really a punishment, founded fear-based punishment, really robs us of the joy of spirituality, which is something we were made for, I believe.
Well, so I haven't been to church. I'm not even sure in probably decades. And actually, the last time I remember going to church was after September 11th, 2001. I remember going, and it was packed, and it was like a multi-denominational, trans-denominational, that sort of everybody is welcome sort of thing. And it was very powerful and empowering. But I asked myself, what happened over the last 20 or so years that when I'm experiencing crisis, my first thought isn't let's go to church, because that I remember back that it was literally like that's what we're doing. We're going to church on Sunday because we have to make sense of what makes no sense, and church was the place to do that. How what do you see having transpired over the last couple of decades that's changed the way people approach their religion?
Well, I don't know if it's any different necessarily. It could just be heightened. But my take is that we are looking for a spirituality for this life to help us love our neighbors, help us live in the world, that gives us direction how to live a flourishing life, that shows us how to build flourishing communities, strong connections with each other, with our own hearts, and with God. But unfortunately, a focus on the afterlife, and whenever hell is a part of the picture, this is why I really go hard about the doctrine of hell. Because if something is horrible as eternal, like they really believe, the traditional Christian position is that if you're not a Christian, then the worst possible suffering for the longest possible amount of time is what happens to you. That tends to become the focus of your spirituality, believing the right thing so that you don't go there. It becomes an afterlife focused spirituality, not really focused on what makes for peace, love, and justice in this life for the sake of this world. And I think that's where spirituality happens, in this world, not waiting for the next world. And that's where I think hell really robs us of that focus on this world. So if you go to church and you're looking for solace, you're looking for direction, you're looking for help, and it's saying, hey, you need to give your life to Jesus, or else, you know, you're not saved. In other words, you're not going to go to heaven when you die. That might pull you making a decision out of a sense of fear, but it doesn't actually help you to love. It doesn't actually help you to see yourself in your neighbor and your neighbor in yourself, which is what connects us together. And so I do think that Christianity has kind of ceded some ground. And I think that we need to remember that Jesus' message was not about what happened when we died. The message of the kingdom of God, that's what he called it, that was a message for this life. It was a revolution that was supposed to take place in this life. I do think that if you go to church and they're not actually helping you love your neighbors better, yeah, of course you're going to throw it away. What's the point of this?
Well, yeah, I mean, when you, the punitive nature of it, obviously, that's what pushed me away initially. But I remember even years after being beaten by my nuns, not wanting to listen to Nine Inch Nails' "Terrible Lie." Like I would always skip over that track because I don't know if you're familiar with the song, but it's definitely. I think it's like it gives birth to many an atheist, and I would skip over it because I'm like, if I listen to this track and it's actually a good track, I'm like, I'm going
I bet it's a
to
banger.
hell. It's a
Right.
banger. Right? I was like, Trent Reznor. And I ask myself, how much are people willing to miss out on in this life by way of connection and community for this idea that may or may not
Mm.
exist?
I mean, that track is a great example of where Christian spirituality often goes when it's rooted in, I think, the wrong things. A lot of times Christians, there's like sort of a satanic panic over different things, whether it be certain rock songs, or Pokemon cards, or Harry Potter, or Ouija boards, or some of these different things that Christians can get worked up about. Starbucks cups. I don't know if you remember that one. a lot of times there's this idea that, oh, those things are spiritually dangerous. A book about witchcraft or something like that is spiritually dangerous, demonic. And what they miss is that in the Bible, demonic powers, what the Apostle Paul called the principalities and powers, or the force that rule over this world, they're not like something as arbitrary and silly as Pokemon cards. It's talking about the forces of domination that structure society. What's truly demonic are the forces that say that some people don't matter as much as other people. And actually, if people are brown, maybe it's okay to racially profile them, and ICE should be able to actually profile on the basis of race. That's a demonic force called white supremacy. I would
Right.
say the
And it's,
patriarchy. Yeah,
well, yeah,
right.
and it just, again, it reminds me of how religion was used to justify slavery over and over again, and that in some ways, the way that enslaved people were able to survive was by thinking about the afterlife. Like, if we only we'll have salvation in the afterlife, we don't have to be comfortable or safe in this world. And as a matter of fact, can't wait to get to the next world. And so it does feel, in a way, similar to like spiritual bypassing. Like, I'm not going to fix this world. I'm not going to worry about this world because the afterlife is going to be good and I'll be there.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's a perfect example. In fact, in my book, I pull an illustration from Kelly Brown Douglas, is a womanist theologian. That's the theology from a Black woman's perspective. And she wrote a really powerful book called The Black Christ, where she contrasts the white Christ and the Black Christ. And the white Christ she describes as the slaveholders' Christ. The Christ that they believed in was a Jesus who you were supposed to believe that Jesus was God and that he died for your sins so that you could go to heaven when you died. As long as you did that, you could go on being a slaveholder and still be a Christian because you believe the right thing. You've checked that belief box. You believe the right thing about Jesus, and so you could go on your merry way. But the Christ of the slaves, although the slaveholders tried to push that version of Jesus onto their slaves and say, yeah, just focus on the afterlife, that pie in the sky religion, which will numb you to the realities of this life. However, what actually developed amongst the slaves was a different perspective of Christ, because they actually saw, when they looked at the message of Jesus, that Jesus was consistently on the side of the oppressed, always standing with the vulnerable, that came to preach good news to the poor, which was liberation for this life, not just the next life. And ultimately, the evangelical Christ and the Christ of most of American Christianity is still the white Christ of the slaveholders, as opposed to this vision of the Black Christ, which was the Christ who stands in solidarity with the oppressed. And I would love for us to reclaim that vision, because I think it's far more biblical. Unfortunately, as you point out, that vision of a disembodied Jesus has been used to justify some of the worst atrocities.
Well, yeah, and I think it's what's pushed a lot of people away from religion and community. And there's a documentary, I can't remember what it's called, but it's on Netflix, and it talks about how, and this is just to relate it to politics, is how it's the communities that have strong bonds and structures that are able to work through their differences and their difficulties to be able to actually have policies that govern and that serve everybody. And that without that community, with community being fractured, those are the ones that suffered the most. Those are the ones that fell apart. And so it seems like we are suffering that because we're not able to find a space like the church where people coming from different backgrounds can come together on a worldview that actually upholds and uplifts everyone.
Yeah, we're missing out on a lot, because I do still believe in the power of the church. I think we are definitely desperate for community. We
Mhm.
are lonelier and more anxious than we've ever been. And we are divided. And unfortunately, most of our spirituality, the dominant religion of our country, is not really helping us. I think it might be dividing us further. Because if at the center of that religion, it says the people that don't agree with you are going to hell, you're not supposed to love and accept them where they're at. You're supposed to change and convert, and colonize them. That is not a message that unifies us.
Well, especially when it's happening to one's own children. You talk a lot about the LGBTQ community, both online, and you also mention a story in your book. Can you share with us? Because I have a very hard time with understanding how somebody could tell their own child, no, you can't come to Thanksgiving
Yeah.
with your partner. You actually can't come at all. And then say that that's love. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, I talk in my book how hell distorts the very meaning of love. Because if something like hell exists, then really the most loving thing you can do is try to save people from hell, no matter how unloving your actions might be. And one of the examples that I've seen over and over and over again in friends and with people that I've communicated with is parents who have rejected their queer children by not going to their weddings, by not inviting them to family get-togethers. And what they will often say is, I love you, and that's why you can't come, because I love you too much to condone a lifestyle that's going to condemn you to hell. And so their way of loving them, really, hell, it twists the very meaning of love. When your fundamental worldview is exclusionary, that unless people are like me and believe like me, they're going to be excluded and they deserve to be punished, then it's going to twist your actual attempts to love people will be twisted by punishment and exclusion. And so these people, they think they're being spiritual. At the moment they believe they're actually being true to God, true to their religion, true to spirituality, they are doing the most exclusionary thing imaginable. They're cutting off their own children and calling it love. And I've seen this over and over again. And I believe if you have any gay listeners, they will probably resonate with that if they were raised in the church. And what I will often tell people is, I want you, maybe this will give you some grace for your parents. They are, in fact, trying to love you, but they have believed a fundamental worldview that has twisted the very meaning of love. And so my parents, if I'm not gay, but they do really disagree with many of the things that I talk about because they are still fundamentalist Christians. And my dad has recently called me a heretic. And he's afraid that I'm going to hell. And he has said some things that were hurtful to me. And in those moments, I have to remind myself he's doing his best to love me. But unfortunately, nothing fucks up love like hell.
Nothing fucks up love like hell. That is so well said. And I have to try to understand even more. Is it they think that that it will change the behavior, that it'll force a change and say, well, okay, since I can't go to Thanksgiving because I am gay and I'll go to hell, so I will change and then I can come to Thanksgiving? Or are
Right.
they afraid of hell by proximity? Like if I let this sinner
Great
into my
question.
home, I'll also go to hell.
Right. Because on the face of it, it doesn't seem like it'll be very effective, right? To reject someone in that way. I think it is a few things. I think a lot of this is led by pastors who tell that's what faithfulness looks like. And so I have heard pastors preach to their congregations, you should not go to a gay wedding. If you go to a gay wedding, that is you enforcing sin. And I mean, first of all, I think it's illogical because you can actually go to a gay wedding and say, listen, I'm here because I love you, regardless of what I believe about homosexuality. I just love you as a person. You could do that. That's an option. But I think a lot of times it's because pastors know that if people had proximity to that love, they would see these are just people and love is just love. And it would actually soften them, because what breaks our hearts open with empathy is proximity, relationships, and connection. And that's what heals us. That's what brings us together. And that is the true essence of spirituality. And unfortunately, in order to reinforce that worldview of exclusion, you do have to keep distance and keep disconnection.
That's wild because that isolation is exactly what happens in abusive relationships. It's like you keep people away because you don't want to trigger that empathy muscle. I've talked with people on the show before about the toxic empathy, but that's just wild to me because it feels like you talk about in your book severing the relationship with oneself, severing the relationship with God, severing the relationship with other people. To not be able to have that, because there's mirroring neurons that happen, and that's what creates empathy. To cut that off and to believe that that is the path, to me feels like it would create enough cognitive dissonance that anyone who is exposed to, I don't know, just anything outside that worldview would be enough to turn the light on and say, you know what, I'm gonna I'm gonna check out this
Well,
other church.
it often does. It often, honestly, one of the ways that I've seen people really wake up and break from their exclusionary worldviews is when, often, like when when a child comes out and they're forced to reckon with this, oh, these are real people, and all of a sudden I can empathize with the situation. That's what does often cause light bulbs to come on. But I think for some people, I mean, when that doesn't do it, when your own child isn't enough of a reason to change, then I do think that you might be pretty far gone. And the reason for that is it is a complete worldview upheaval. For some people, their formative ideas of who God is, who they are, what the world is all about are formed on that binary of there's an in group, there's an out group, there's people like me and there's people like them. And to do a total upheaval to that worldview is maybe too much for some people, and it's easier to retreat back into fear.
Help me understand, because I can understand wanting to isolate themselves from the world and say, hey, we're going to go to our own churches and our own schools, and we're going to get vouchers, and we're going to go to our own colleges, and we're going to keep our kids away from that mess. Help me understand why they want to make hell on earth
On Earth,
for the
yeah.
rest of
Why are they
us who
doing
do
it for everybody
not.
else?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I mean, their religion. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. There's no one reason, but in terms of what my book is about, in talking about the spirituality of hell, they live in a world where people don't believe their religion will die and go to hell. And so their mission, so for me, the purpose of spirituality and what we should be doing in terms of outreach engagement in the world, I want to see the world be a better place. That's simple. I care about the flourishing of the world, of humanity, the future of our planet, what kind of societies we create. But if a lot of these Christians, one of their mantras about when it comes to this world is it's all going to burn. Jesus is going to come back. This world is going to be wiped out. What really matters is the next world. And so when it comes to engagement in the world politically, the flourishing, what leads to the most flourishing for the most number of people is not the first priority. A bigger priority than that is the power of Christianity and Christian institutions so that they can convert as many people to the religion to save them from going to hell. That's a bigger priority, as well as particular pet projects like, for example, not everybody, but one of the reasons that many evangelicals support Israel unilaterally, no matter what Israel does, is because they play into their end time scenarios. They believe that a strong Israel is necessary to cause Jesus to come back. And so it is apocalyptic in their engagement with the world and with politics. It is more driven by theological agendas, which are related to the end of the world and the afterlife, rather than to the flourishing of the world in this life.
So I got to ask: is there a certain segment of Christians, of fundamentalists, evangelicals, who are like so miserable that they can't wait for the end days? They're just like, yes, bring it on, because they're not enjoying themselves. Like I'm trying to wrap my head around it.
Yeah, it's hard to, I do think there is a pessimism. I mean, I was raised being told that people are fundamentally evil and deserve hell by default. So when you have that as your starting point, I do think it matters how you view the world and how you treat people in general. Whether you think people are fundamentally bad or fundamentally good is a real basic tenet. And so for example, I used to believe that by default, people fundamentally deserve punishment. Now I believe that people fundamentally deserve love. And I do think that when you have that optimism versus that pessimism, it does cause the way you view the world to include the future of the planet. And so many of these people, even though they believe God created this planet, they don't really see, for instance, that most Christians don't really take climate change seriously. They think God's going to erase this world anyway. This world is going to hell in a handbasket. It's kind of a lost cause. We shouldn't be fighting for things like the future of the planet. God's going to take care of that. And I do think, I don't know if it's that they hate their lives or hate the world, but I think when that is and it's bred into you from your earliest memories, people are bad, people deserve to be punished. I do think that gives you a fundamental pessimism about the world.
So is your book targeted towards people who you're hoping to give them optimism about the world again and show them how Christianity can help bring people together? Like who's it for? Is it for
Who's it
other,
for?
pastors? Like who's gonna
Yeah, I
well,
tried to write it
immediately.
for a pretty broad audience. On the one hand, I wrote it, I think the number one audience that it's for is people who were raised in any kind of Christianity and received a bit of a punitive spirituality
Mhm.
to help them deconstruct some of those things without having to throw away spirituality altogether. Because for the most part, when people leave the church, leave Christianity, it's usually not because of Jesus. I've almost never met anybody who is like, yeah, I'm not a Christian anymore because Jesus sucks. That guy is so problematic. Like that's just never really happened. It's usually because of abusive churches, authoritarian leaders, patriarchal structures, harm the religion of Christianity.
Mhm.
And I think that we can see that so much of that is actually because they're not following the spirituality of Jesus, not because they're reflecting it well, but because they've twisted it very, very badly. And so I think that's helpful. And for me, the goal is not that people stay Christian. I don't really care how you label yourself. I don't believe that God's going to punish you if you're not a Christian, but I do want you to be able to have a spirituality that works for you, that leads you to liberation and wholeness. I will also say, for people who not consider themselves Christians at all, or are even atheists, but want to understand, maybe friends or family members who are Christian or have been raised in the church, I think this will give some enlightenment to that. I do also hope that it starts a conversation in Christianity as a whole, because
Mhm.
I do think as a whole, Christianity is too much focused on the afterlife and heaven and hell and misses this life, because I think as a whole, and again, not every single Christian, not every single church, but as a whole, Christianity is quite hell-bent. And I do hope it starts a conversation about taking hell out of the center of Christian faith, out of the foundation of what spirituality is. So those are some
Do
of
you
my
feel
hopes for
I also have that hope. It's a book for everyone. I feel like this is like the one you want to like slide at, whenever I'm at CVS, they have like the Bible books that are like on the choice books, I think it's called, that are right by the pharmacy. This is like the book that you want to like slide in there. You just,
give it to
everybody needs
grandma.
to read.
Start a fun conversation. Just
Well,
next Thanksgiving. You guys think about hell lately? Anybody?
well, speaking of grandma, do you feel like the younger generation with access to the internet and other ideas is less likely to be locked into this dogma of the punitive church, or are they also
Bro,
just deeply
dude, I
riveted because
wish,
they're
but the data is saying the exact opposite. Gen Z is flooding into very dogmatic churches right now. I think actually because many of them were so rudderless and weren't given much, they are grasping onto something that feels, the dogma is very comforting. It's a way of easing certain anxieties. When it's like, here's a controlled system, a worldview. Oh, you feel unsafe? Here's a system where you believe this and you're in the right religion. Then you enter the in group and now you're safe. And that safety is achieved by having an out group that's going to be punished. And that worldview can be very attractive. And it seems like actually young people, especially young men, are embracing quite dogmatic forms of Christianity right now. Actually, for the very first time in history that I'm aware of, more men than women are in the church. It used to historically always be more women than men in the church, because spirituality tends to draw women in. Women tend to be more attuned to their heart, to emotions, to connection, which is the stuff that spirituality is made of. And so churches were usually 60-40 women. But now, for the first time in history, it's more men. And a lot of that is because spirituality isn't really happening in many churches. It is more about rigid systems of control and reinforcing hierarchy, which does tend to appeal to men who are often very logical and don't value relationships in the same way. So I made some broad brushes there, but that does seem to be what the data is saying right now, which is not great.
well, it seems to be the manosphere kind of morning
Yeah.
routine. You got to have these rigid ways of being in order to establish control, because yes, everything feels so out of control right now, and the easiest way is to go down that path as opposed to getting therapy. Men, go
Yeah,
get
they're leaning
therapy.
into control rather than into connection, and I think that would be my appeal to men, is that route of control. It might ease some anxieties in the short run, but it will not deliver the freedom you're looking for. And I do think that actually a better way to find safety is in connection. Also this is big, but I think it's why we have billionaires at all. Like, why does anybody need that amount of hoarded wealth? There is this desire to control to achieve safety, but
Mhm.
rather to find that safety instead in community and in our connection with one another. That's a little scarier, but I think that's where spirituality really happens. And when the early church put the message of Jesus in practice, people don't think about this enough. The very first thing we see the church doing after the Spirit falls at Pentecost, Acts chapter 2. So right there at the beginning of the early church, they're distributing their proceeds to all that have need. They're creating a mutual aid society, basically, where they're finding their safety, not in hoarding, to control, but in our connection to one another.
Well, and it requires vulnerability, right? And the way our society has treated the vulnerable, I could see why a lot of men are like, yeah, I'm going to pass on that vulnerability and I'm going to learn how to shoot this crossbow for Jesus.
Yeah.
Like it
Oh,
tracks.
for sure. And they can find that society will, I mean, the patriarchy is a pretty old, that's been around for a while. You can find yourself at the top of that system of domination and find safety there, but that actually alienates you from people. And that's one of the points that I make in my book is spirituality. The work of connection means dismantling those domination systems that disconnect us and that alienate us. Whenever you find yourself in a position of superiority, if I find my safety by being separate from and better than and elevated to other people, then I might feel safe in that position of elevation, but I'm actually alienating myself from humanity, my own humanity included.
It's a very, very lonely place to be. The story of the lonely, mean billionaire exists, I think, for a reason. So, Brian, I could talk to you forever. I can't wait for
Fun.
more people to have your
People
book
say you
in their
shouldn't talk
hands.
about religion and politics, but how much fun you can have. Oh my God.
Exactly, exactly. There's nothing to fear here, folks. We can do this. When your book is out at the end of this month, where can people find it?
September 30th, Hellbent, How the Fear of Hell Holds Christians Back from Spirituality of Love, anywhere, obviously Amazon is an easy place to get it, especially if you want on Kindle or Audible. I did record the audio myself, but the best place to get any book is at your local bookstore to shop local. I'm always encouraging people to do that. Or if funds are tight, one really cool thing you could do is request it at your local library.
I love that. I love that we're remembering that libraries are amazing third spaces in community. So maybe
It's a
even
whole
start
free thing that we do.
it should be a part of the book club, y'all. Get Brian's book for the book club. And then where can people find you online? You're on IG at
B.E. Recker, Recker, at B.E. Recker is my Instagram. And yeah, you can find me there.
amazing. So, and I can't, do you have a Substack? Are you on Substack?
I do, yeah. On Substack, it's called Beloved with Brian Recker, and I post different meditations on Christian spirituality, reflections on the political moment as well. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Well, we have more to chat about. So we're just going to have to follow up at some other time because I want to talk about that church that I wandered into
Oh man,
that looked super
fearless
cool.
church.
And ended up not being super cool. So that'll be for the next time. Thank you so much again for joining me, and we'll chat soon.
Thanks for having me, Miami.
Thanks. All right, y'all, you heard it. It's book club time. I truly do believe that the answers that we seek are right in front of our faces. It's each other, it's finding community and saying, you are not going to separate us. And we have to have a better understanding of different communities. And so, a lot of the comments that I see online are people not understanding what is driving so much of the hate that we're seeing right now because they're like, oh, but it's hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy. Yes, it is hypocrisy, but it's also like they're waiting for the end of the world. And so I understand not caring about the climate if you're just like, you know what, this life I'm living, it's not the one, it's the one after this one. And so in order to understand people, and I don't want to say beat them because that's not what we're trying to do. We're just trying to create a world in which everyone can thrive. And then if they want to go to the afterlife and the end times, I don't know, maybe we can we got to brainstorm here. Maybe we need like a little tiny end times village where people can go and experience the end times. I don't know. There's no bad ideas in brainstorming, y'all. But I just refuse to believe that we have to be in hell on earth when we could experience joy on earth with each other. So that's our task. We have to figure that out. Please go grab Brian's book and check back in next week. Thank you for supporting Punching Up. I'll see y'all soon.